This is the worst crash of American capitalism since the Great Depression. So that means everybody watching, listening to this program, this is the worst economic crash in our lifetimes, all of us. It is a profound testimony to the fundamental instability of the capitalist system. If you look at the history of capitalism, both in the United States and anywhere else in the world where it has settled, it has an economic downturn. And by the way, many words for it: recession, depression, bust, crash. I mean, the language is full of it. Why? Because it happens on average every 4 to 7 years. That is for centuries. Everything has been tried in capitalism to get rid of this instability. Because the capitalists, the people who like capitalism, always understood correctly that a system that crashes like this every 4 to 7 years, throwing millions of people out of work, destroying businesses, interrupting or destroying educations, breaking up families, this disaster happening every 4 to 7 years is hardly a recommendation for the system. And so they really did try, using their best minds, to figure out a way to stop it from happening. Give you an example. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the president then, Franklin Roosevelt, went on the radio and gave a famous speech. And in the speech, he said, I have some plans for how to get us out of this depression. And I want you to support me. And I promise you in exchange that these measures that I'm proposing will not only get us out of this depression, but will prevent us from having more depressions so that our children will not suffer this kind of collapse of the economy the way we are. Roosevelt promised it, and every president since has promised it. But no president has ever been able to deliver on the promise. The promise has been betrayed, and we are now in the biggest betrayal since the Great Depression. The unemployment rates we have now are Depression-era unemployment rates. The collapse of production, likewise. But let me review the three that we've had in our new century, because in a way they illustrate the point. Early in the spring of 2000, we had a crash of our economy. We called it the dot-com crash. Why? Because the prices of shares of dot-com companies had gone through the roof in the stock market. Now, you didn't have to be a genius to understand that prices of shares go through the roof from time to time without causing a crash. So blaming it on the prices didn't make too much sense, but it was very helpful to distract people from asking the obvious question, why is this system crashing again, having been told that we had learned from the earlier crashes how to avoid it? Didn't work. We had a crash. 7 years later, in 2008, we had another crash. The only difference was it had a different name. It was called the subprime mortgage crash. Again, blaming the trigger rather than the system that's unstable. It was worse than the one in 2000. And here we are in the year 2020. Boom, we got the third one of this century, and this one we're going to be calling the COVID-19 crash or something like that. Once again, blaming the trigger that happens just at the same time rather than the system. 20 years of a new century, 3 crashes, works out to a little under 7 years. Bingo, just what we would expect. And most people knew that this crash was coming and predicted it long before we knew anything about the virus and what it would do. So for me, I see this as the worst crash of the 3. That's not a good sign. It shows us that the measures taken after 2000 didn't prevent or reduce the awfulness of the one in 2008. And now again, only more so since 2008 to this one. We have the pandemic, which no doubt makes it much worse. This is a system that seems to me to, and let me stop with that, to have failed. I mean, there's no nice way to say this. You know, viruses have been with us from day one. It's part of nature. Viruses are things in nature that can be very toxic to plants, to animals, to people. We had a terrible one 100 years ago in 1918, very famous. People know about it. We've had more recent ones, MERS, SARS, Ebola. I mean, we know, and we should have been prepared. What in the world is wrong with a system that didn't prepare for what we knew was coming? Sort of the same question that the fires in the West Coast are making us ask. We knew what was coming, and here we are with our fingers in our noses because we haven't gotten ready, and now we're not containing it. The United States is a rich capitalist country. We have 4.5% of the population of the world and over 20% of the COVID cases and the COVID deaths. That failure of a system. Last point. Why do I keep saying it's a failure of this system? Here's the way to make it really clear. I understand that no capitalist company of the kind that might produce tests or masks or ventilators or hospital beds, they're not going to produce those beds, store them in a warehouse somewhere, make sure they stay, in good shape for an indefinite amount of time before they can sell it. They're not going to do that because it isn't profitable. And capitalism says to the company, you do what's profitable and you avoid what isn't. So they don't produce those things. Okay, we all understand that. The government then can compensate for the failure of private capitalism to manage this situation. By the way, this situation is called public health, fundamental need of human beings. So private capitalism stinks at taking care of public health for the reasons we all understand. Well, the government could come in, and the government could buy up tests, masks, ventilators, ICU units, all the rest of it, and store them around the country and make sure they stay in good shape, replace them if they wear out, blah, 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 blah. We know the government can do it because that's what it does with military equipment. It doesn't pay a company to produce a tank or a machine gun or an airplane. So the government comes in, buys all that stuff, making a nice profit for the companies that produce them. And then the government, at its own expense, that is you and me, pay for storing it and locating it around the country for a military emergency. But our government didn't do that for a medical emergency. So we were unprepared. And we are now paying the price. 200,000 nearly dead. I mean, it's unspeakable what's going on. The failure is catastrophic. I don't think I have to explain to people that we can do better than capitalism. We're living through the proof of it. Look, I understand there's a joke that used to be made about Marxist economists. The joke went like this. Marxist economists have predicted 10 of the last 4 recessions. The answer being Marxists keep seeing the end of capitalism and it doesn't show up. Look, I'm not a predictor. I don't believe in prediction. I can't tell you when this system will disappear. But I don't feel I have to prove that it will. And here's the reason. Every system before capitalism displays the following pattern. It's born, it evolves over time, and then it dies and passes away. We had slavery, it was born, it developed, it died. We had feudalism, born, developed, died. We have capitalism, born, developed. What's the next step? But for me, it's not a question of whether. It's a question of when and how. And I'm for the first time, because I haven't felt this way before, I am now looking at a system I don't see how it gets out of the dead end it has waltzed itself into. In this country in particular, Western Europe, North America, Japan, I think capitalism is exhausted here. Not in Brazil, not in India, not in China. They still have a ways to go because they were late to the party. But we were the early ones, and we the capitalist initial parts of the world, we can't solve our problems anymore. That's what's showing up. We can't keep ourselves healthy. We can't prevent our forests from burning down. We cannot solve our racial difficulties. We cannot solve, our misogynistic history. We can't deal with the problems that we have. And that's a sign of a system that's exhausted. And I see the signs around me. And so I'm beginning now to think in an ongoing way that we are in a declining system, which is difficult to face up to. It's hard to go through. The last century have seen the British people still unable to understand that their empire is over, acting as if they were something other than a small, cold, wet island off of the mainland of Europe. I mean, that's hard. I understand that. We're going to have the same difficulty. And I see Trump and the horrors of what he represents as a symptom of a declining system raging against the world. This morning, the World Trade Organization reached a conclusion that the tariffs Mr. Trump imposed on China are illegal, contrary to World Trade Organization, and have to stop. Mm-hmm. Look at that. There he was, Mr. Rageful, punishing the world with tariffs. All it did was unify the rest of the world against the United States. These are the ragings of a person who can't effectively accept that the game is coming to an end, and we have to adjust to play a role in the world that is something other than King of the Hill that we believed before. That, I think, is the real challenge of how to manage this decline so it doesn't take us all down with it.